I just get started and I don't think about that. So yeah, that's never going to be a problem when you tell me that. Okay, let me set this up. We'll be writing a bunch of terms on this one. Okay, so the nature of learning is, and I'm actually going to read this one off because I don't have it memorized, but all right. This is, and you know, if you get different books, you get slight variations of this, but the usual definition reads like a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs because of experience. This would be like that you tried to wake up in the morning to make this class without setting an alarm. And so you find out that doesn't work. Through experience, you learned that you need to use your alarm clock to get up this early. You changed your behavior because of experience. And you can probably think of, and I encourage you to do so, to think of the examples in your life where you've had to make changes because of the experience that you encountered. And sometimes it's as simple as when you first walked into VTI, this place is a maze, right? I mean, it was tough to find your way around in the first day or two or three, but through experience, you learned your way around and you got to where, okay, I know where to go to get to my classes. And each time you get each term you start a new class, you got to figure out what class to go to at what time. And through experience, you're able to do that. Okay. Now, this kind of learning is really essential for survival at all levels of animal life. You know, and when I think of birds, which I do a lot, we recently went through that freeze. This was a big danger to the survival of birds. And one of the things that we did was we worked to make sure that, heck, we probably fed the birds better than we did ourselves. Luckily, we have a gas stove, so we were able to cook food while the power was out. I could put a lighter to the gas and we had flame, so that helped. Okay, Byron, I got you. As soon as I find your name. But we, the birds learned very quickly that we were a place where they could get food. And, you know, on the internet, whenever we could access it, people were out there on the bird site saying, make sure you keep plenty of food and variety of it out there. And so we did. And it did pay off. We did find one small dead bird out there when everything thawed. And we thought it wasn't doing good in the first place. It probably wouldn't have been surviving regardless of the freeze. But, you know, we did. And we literally had hundreds of birds coming in our backyard, and we don't have a big backyard. So I spent a lot of time with my camera, I got plenty of batteries, but I had nothing else to do during daylight, you know, so I just sat out there taking all sorts of pictures. I took 1,000 pictures over the freeze. I bet you're real surprised at that. Got some good ones though. Probably the only chance I ever get to get bird pictures in snow. So, because that's a rare opportunity for me. But what we did, what happened there was that the birds had learned food, free food, good buffet, and they really came around for that. So, you know, it's one of the things, and again, Darwin's theory of evolution is not survival of the fittest. It is the survival of the species most adaptive to change. And that means they have to learn. You know, if they're for whatever reason, they're not able to learn to survive as things can change, then it's going to affect their ability to not go extinct. At the end of the last ice age, all the woolly mammoths passed away. We don't have those anymore. They could not adapt to the warming climate. They were just built too much for cold weather. And as the area of the earth shrunk that was cold weather earth, then they were no longer able to adapt. They couldn't learn how to do something else, but their biology kind of prevented them. And that was followed by their main predator, which is the saber-toothed tiger. So again, the learning that you have to do to survive is sometimes dependent upon what your biology is. Okay. All right. Now we've got two types of learning. All right. We have got observational learning and we have associative learning. Now, observational learning is it's real simple. I mean, that's self-defining, really. You learn by watching. You see somebody else do something, you copy it, and that's the start of it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you don't keep doing it. Well, you're not supposed to. You're supposed to learn that to do something else. The other type, the associative learning, and that's where we're going to really be spending a lot of time talking about in detail. This is where a connection is made between two events. Most of you will have found out that if you study hard, you make good grades. That's associative learning. You learn that if you study, you'll do better on tests. You learn that if you eat something that is too old, that you can get sick. How many of you have ever had food poisoning? And how many of you just really don't even want to eat whatever it was that gave you food poisoning again? You know, yeah. The worst case I ever had was from some ham. Somebody gave me as a gift, and the day wasn't hot, but it was out of refrigeration too long. And when I ate it as a sandwich, I put it in my fridge when I got home, but it had stayed out too long. And but the problem was the food poisoning didn't have any smell, any taste, or discoloration types of clues. There were no clues. It smelled fine, it tasted fine. And 5 hours later, I'm sitting there going, something is terribly wrong. Whoa, it certainly was too. So yeah, it truly is. There's something about food poisoning where you understand what the term poisoning really means. Yeah, we're actually going to talk about a couple of these things that I'll still eat ham, but I'm a lot more careful about it now. But there are certain things that you may eat one time and you don't ever eat again. The learning association with it is so powerful. That often happens, I think, when we're children, and we're just a little more sensitive to the kind of violently ill we can get on certain foods. So yeah, it's Susan, I understand. The one reason you'd ever want to have peanut butter around is you get crunchy peanut butter, because you can hide pills in them for dogs. Doesn't mean you have to eat it, but if the sight of it gets to you, you may have to have somebody else give it to the dog. Okay. Now, and I mentioned that, just touched on this a little bit. Let's look at some biological factors in learning. All right. People, animals, all creatures are limited by their biology. There's certain physical features that we all have that allow us to learn to do more things than others. And we know that animals can do a lot of things that we can't do. Animals that go around on 4 legs can go a lot faster than we can in many cases. We're limited by our physics and our physical features as just to how fast we could possibly run if you're in the total peak condition. You know, the fastest, I think, human being that's ever been measured is around 20 miles an hour or so. Yeah, Everclear, yeah, that'll teach you some lessons. One time was all I did, Everclear. I didn't even get sick. It just was like, oh man, that was not fun. Not fun at all. And didn't taste very good either. But these physical features that we have, we also have one that gives us a great advantage. And that's the size of our craniums. That gives us more brain per poundage than pretty much any other animal on Earth, except dolphins and porpoises. And I think we've only really just scratched the surface of how intelligent they are, but they get limited as to what they can learn because they don't have these. They don't have hands with 5 digits on each hand and an opposable thumb. That gives us such an advantage on how much more we can learn and do. Dolphins and porpoises can't learn how to build things, put things together, because they don't have that capability physically to do that kind of thing. So what you can learn and what you're not going to learn can very much be determined by what you look like, how you're built. So these kinds of things, the brain capacity has a lot to do with it too. Dogs learn some language. They don't learn to speak it. I mean, I love some of the videos where they have dogs go, I love you, but they're not really stating language that they understand so much. It's just a sound they get reinforced for. Because whenever a dog says something like that, everybody's going to react, give it attention, and the dog's going to like the attention. I mean, dogs love attention. So that gets that behavior reinforced and they'll continue doing it. But their brain capacity doesn't allow them to learn language like we know it. They'll learn a few words. They can understand kind of at the level of maybe a 2-year-old human can, but their brain capacity just isn't the same as ours. So in terms of language, they can't do that. On the other hand, their brains are much more developed for smell. And not only that, but their physiology is too, unless you're built like Seamus, who has a very flat nose. Brachiocephalic, they call that. And but he still relies on his nose because what they smell gives them so much more information than what we smell, even though smell is a powerful and really understudied phenomena in humans. But we don't have near the brain percentage that's attuned to smell as dogs do. So their learning is a great deal more dependent on what they can smell than ours is. All right, now I'll give you another one of those good terms here. It's called instinctive drift. And remember, we talked about instincts a little bit, and I think the second chapter it was, that in my opinion, humans don't have instincts, that we've got reflexes, but we don't have instincts. But there are certainly, I mean, especially again with birds, we see instincts. You know, they have the instinct to migrate. There's an instinct for, you know, we talk about the mothering instinct, but we found that sometimes when animals are orphaned, they don't really learn so much about parenting as the children of animals that have parents that raise them. So that can be it's kind of questionable how much instinct is there. But a good example of what happens with instinctive drift is the instincts can overpower learning. If I remember right, it's otters that like to wash their food before they eat it. And we cannot reinforce that behavior out of them. There's just something in an otter's DNA that makes them wash their food before they eat it. So they can, the instincts in animals, raccoons, yeah, that's the other one. If otters do it, maybe it's just raccoons. But regardless, we're looking at an animal with a species that you just can't train out of them. They're going to always go back to that. The instincts can overpower learned behaviors. Okay. One other factor in learning is how prepared is an animal to learn. And this is we call it preparedness. And this is an organism's tendency to learn in certain ways. And back to the taste aversion thing, you know, when you learn it's like in humans, if you learn something's bad for you, you don't want to eat it again. Now, and again, you think about our ancestors running around in tribes, very primitive. They didn't, in many cases, they ran into, as they migrated around the earth, you know, they ran into new foods, new plants, new fruits, new vegetables, new animals. And they're not all going to taste the same. And until you tried one, you didn't really know. Now, maybe you could smell something, oh, I'm not eating that. But there are many things that don't have enough smell to turn you off. But somebody had to eat the things that we learned are not good for you to start with before the word could spread. And their bodies have ways of telling you that when you associate vomit with food, you're probably not going to want to eat it again. I have not been to McDonald's in 30 years because the last 2 times I ate there, I got home. I didn't have food poisoning. I just threw up. I don't need that. So I'm not going back to McDonald's, and I haven't been there in many years, 89, 90, in there. I'm sorry?
Their fries are so good.
There are good fries everywhere. Their burgers are not going to make me throw up ever again.
Well, there except for fries.
So, yeah, I mean, Whataburger has the greatest burger, and they've got good fries. So I'm happy. So, and it's a Texas company. So except for it got bought by somebody in Chicago, I think that was.
It used to be a Texas company until they recently sold it.
Yeah, to a company in Chicago. I know somebody in Chicago, and I told her, you better make sure they don't change a thing, or we're going to come get you. You know, which we probably would. We are possessive of that. Just get off the topic for just a moment. Remember back during Harvey when all sorts of emergency workers came to Texas to help out, and there was a great video that went around on Facebook and probably with the rest of the internet too. But there's this firefighter from New York. Somebody went out and got the whole crew of people some Whataburgers and fries. And this one guy's going, so this is the big Texas Whataburger. Yeah, we've heard about this. We'll see. And he took one bite and he goes, wow, that's a burger. I mean, it just impressed him no end. It was so funny. I mean, I got a kick out of that. Okay. The thing about associating vomit with food, you know, if the sickness doesn't kill you, then you still won't like it anymore and you won't eat it anymore. And you can kind of spread the word at that point in time. And that's how our ancestors learned what was edible and what wasn't. You know, there's certain animals whose meat tasted very good, but depending on how you prepared it. Of course, the discovery of fire had a lot to do with what was more edible and safer to eat, for that matter. I'm sure everything tasted really gamey back in the old days for the most part, but if you found something that didn't, you were more likely to go try and kill that and eat it. So the same thing with vegetables. You know, it's kind of interesting. A lot of the vegetables we eat now, you know, people are so horrified by genetically modified. All food is genetically modified these days. There's just nothing that hasn't been fooled with to try and improve the yield, the taste, and everything else. If you ever see a sample of the original ear of corn, I think there's a museum down in Goliad where they have like a sample of like one of the original. It's very, very small. It's colored differently. It didn't have near the yield of the corn that we were all raised on. It's all of it's genetically modified. It's nothing to be that horrified about. It's what we try and do. We have to improve the yield. We have too many people now to support with the food that existed 500 years ago. So, but that is a big part of being prepared to learn something. You're learning things that'll help you survive, unless that food that you try for the first time gets you good. Okay, any questions on this first little section? If not, we're going to move into the first major section here, which is called classical conditioning. One way to think of classical conditioning is that it's passive learning. You're not going to act on the environment, it's going to act on you. Okay? What's going to happen here is that you're going to pair something that was previously neutral, that would not have an effect on you, with something meaningful, something that would just automatically get a response from you. And then you learn that that previously neutral thing now means something, and you'll get a response to it. Let's say that we're all in a classroom together, we're back in normal times again, and every time that I walk in the room, I got a bowl of candy, and I've got enough candy to satisfy everybody's needs. I've got sugarless candy for people who can't do sugar. I got chocolate, I got vanilla, I got fruit flavored, you name it, I got it, and everybody has a chance to get something. After a few days of this, how are y'all going to start feeling when you hear me coming down the hall? There's a chance, especially if you're hungry, and since most of you probably don't eat breakfast, there's a chance your mouth may water at this point. Oh boy, here comes food. Or let's say I'm bringing a whole tray of Whataburgers for everybody. And if you hate Whataburger, you have to leave class right now. I can't tolerate you. But this is the sound of me walking down the hall would have been previously a neutral stimulus. We hear people walking down the hall all the time. We don't really pay much attention to it. It's a neutral stimulus, other than it's a noise that we'll hear. But if you hear it and you associate it with food enough times, that association is going to get a response from you. And that response, in this case, may be something like salivation. All right. Now, we have got a guy, here's a famous name in psychology, but it's also a name that you will hear in conversation at times, you'll read about. So it's an important name to learn. And this is Pavlov. If anybody's ever heard of Pavlov's dog, so I'm going to put Ann Pavlov's dog. One of the probably one of the most important people in psychology, but also um, he's just somebody that's known generally, kind of like Freud. These are people that you will hear the names of and associate certain things with long after you take this course. You'll be hearing these names the rest of your life. So it's a good place to learn more about them. Now, Pavlov himself, I'm going to give you a little background on him because he's kind of interesting. A Russian guy back in the late 1800s, and he was a chemist. Actually, what he studied, he won the Nobel Prize in biology for studying dogs and saliva and its effect on the digestive system. And he did some really good work with this stuff. So good that he won a Nobel Prize. You know, that's the prize that goes out every year, once a year, to the most important scientific discovery of the year. They've got several categories, you know, medicine. They've got the Peace Prize, of course, which is the most famous one. But they also give them out for different fields of science. And Pavlov won one of these for his work purely on studying the digestive system of dogs and the saliva they produce and how that works. And his work that was discovered back then is still considered to be good stuff today. So obviously he knew his stuff in that field. And one day he noticed something. He had dogs that, you know, they'd surgically inserted a little tube into their salivary glands, and it led to a little collection test tube, if you will, on the sides of their jaws. So they could tell when and how much a dog was salivating in response to food. One day, Pavlov noticed as his assistant was walking down the hall, making footsteps with the meat or the meat powder, depending on what he was using at the time, for the dog started salivating early. And again, this is not something you would expect in just a setting in a vacuum. Dogs are not going to salivate just because they hear footsteps unless they learn to associate it with something else. If you have a cat and you have a can opener and you feed your cats with opening cans of dog or cat food, I couldn't get that out. I don't know how to talk about cats. But that cat will come running at the sound of a can opener. Now, that wasn't a behavior they were born with. They learned it because they associated that sound with food. So the dog, Pavlov's dog, learned to associate that the sound of footsteps with foods coming. And so they'd start salivating early. And that is the situation in a nutshell. So I'm going to break this down into the terms that get used in classical conditioning. These are the ones you'll want to learn for the test. Okay. Now we have what we first call the unconditioned stimulus. We abbreviate this the UCS. The unconditioned stimulus is something that normally provokes a response. If I bring in a big steak dinner for everybody and you all like steak and you're not vegetarians, then this would get salivation, just purely the steak itself. Anytime you go by a restaurant that you really enjoy and you smell that food, good food is always going to produce salivation. It's nature's way of preparing you to start eating and start digestion, because digestion starts with the chewing and the salivation that you do in your mouth. So that is an unconditioned stimulus. Food is just a natural thing for us. We've got to have it, and it's going to start the salivation. All right. That salivation we call the unconditioned response. You don't have to condition it. And that will be the UCR. Okay, so the unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus itself is the meat. I present you a stimulus. You respond by salivating. Doesn't have to be conditioned. You don't have to learn that. The body's going to naturally do that. However, now you hear my footsteps coming down the hall. You're a dog. You're attached to this salivary device, measuring device, and you hear my footsteps. And now you salivate, and this is what we call the conditioned response, which of course will be conditioned stimulus. My bad. Erase that, backspace. It's called the CS. And yeah, we'll get the conditioned response in a second. really know how to do a parentheses on that unconditioned response, don't I? Okay. The conditioned stimulus is something that used to be neutral, but you learned that it means something. You hear me coming? And think about this. I'll give you another way to think about it in say a negative way. In a normal class day, when you hear me walking down the hall coming to class, you're not going to get much of a response other than whatever your response is to the start of a class, okay? But if it's test day and you've learned to have a fear of test, the sound of my footsteps on a test day might get the conditioned stimulus or the conditioned response of fear, okay? You can learn, we'll talk about how you can learn fears and all sorts of stuff through classical conditioning, okay? And then we have the conditioned response. ECR, of course. Okay, these four terms is the basis of classical conditioning. So you do want to learn these terms, hint, hint, okay? Here's another way to think of it. How many of you have classes with pop quizzes? Aren't those fun? Don't you love pop quizzes? I always hated those in school. I swore if I was ever a teacher, I'd never give them. And I've been doing this over 30 years and I have never given a pop quiz once. Aren't y'all glad that you're in my class now? I mean, I give you regular tests, but you know they're coming. What if I did give pop quizzes? And what if every time I did it, I just picked up this bell and rang it and started passing it out? Now, normally the sound of a bell going off doesn't mean anything unless you've learned something. If you live near a church, the sound of a bell might mean that, okay, the church is either celebrating something or a call to worship or whatever. But you have to learn that too. Sometimes the sounds, there's certain sounds that give us comfort. The sound of a train in the distance is one of those classic sounds that can be comforting. But you learn these kinds of things over time. What you got to remember here, I want to back up a little bit. All right, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response, the same behaviors. Okay, both the salivation happened in both cases, so it's both the same behavior. What makes the difference is what gets that behavior. All right, food gets salivation, footsteps get salivation. So understand that's an important principle here, that the response, whether it's unconditioned or conditioned, is the same response. Okay. And think about the possibilities with this. How many of y'all are superstitious? Sometimes you learn that from, say, your parents or friends or things, but other times you might learn that, oh, I did this, it's bad luck. A lot of sports fans will feel like they're doing something to jinx their teams, or that it'd be lucky if they don't go to the bathroom, before halftime or something like that. All superstitions, but somehow they acquired these responses by associating something they did with something that happened. Okay. So sometimes, and part of what I deal with in my profession, I've got people, we'll talk about more about phobias later in the term, but a lot of times phobias are fears of things that normally wouldn't have a reason to be scared of. I've got a good friend that she is so afraid of bridges, she will drive miles out of her way not to have to go over a bridge, and especially a big one. I don't think she's ever gone through Lake Charles or to Bridge City. Anybody here been through Bridge City? Especially when the old bridge was there, it was a narrow 2-lane thing that went up about 1,000 feet before it came back down again. That was a cheap thrill bridge. That would give anybody a fear of bridges, I tell you. But you know what? The bridge itself is just, it is what it is. But somehow they learned to associate it and it became a fear object. So how do we acquire these things? Yeah, it is a beautiful view. It really is. And they're building that other half of it. It's a lot better than it used to be. Okay. How do we acquire this response? To sit on the water so they actually float. That's kind of interesting. I haven't been to Washington State. I would like to go there someday. Chasing West Coast birds, of course, but yeah, I go for the scenery too. I've actually got a good friend from graduate school, lives right in the geographical middle of Washington State. It's a little town called Wenatchee. And I talk to her on Facebook every now and then. Okay, we're going to talk about something called acquisition. Actually, most of the West Coast is a beautiful place. Spelling this right. Yeah, that's better. Now, how do we acquire the conditioned response? It takes several trials most of the time, okay? You learn to associate one thing with another over time through what we call extra trials, so that, you know, as the days go by and I keep bringing food to the classroom, maybe by the end of the first week, you start going, say, I hear footsteps, it's the teacher, he might be bringing some food. So you start learning that. And then maybe by the end of the second week, you know, there's food coming. So you have learned to salivate at the sound of my footsteps. All right, so you've got a good conditioned response. The period of time that it took for it to happen is called the acquisition period. And what's very important about learning to associate the two things, the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, is the amount of time in between those. By the time you can hear my footsteps coming down the hall, I'm close to the door. I'm going to be walking in shortly after you hear the footsteps. Boom, here's the food. So that interval is very short, and that's going to increase the acquisition of the conditioned response and the strength of the conditioned response. So that interval, the time interval, is very important. This kind of brings up something I'll talk a little bit more detailed with in a bit, is think about punishment. You know, if you're trying to alter behavior with punishment, the idea between associating a bad behavior with something you don't want to do, how often did you get punished immediately upon doing something bad? First, you had to get caught. And when I was growing up, is wait till your father gets home. So this might be hours between the time that I did what I did till dad got home. And of course, think about the fear object dad becomes at that point. When I hear his footsteps, like, oh no, here we go again. And but that time interval did not teach me to not do. Yeah, you get plenty of anxiety, that's for sure, but you don't learn to associate the behavior necessarily with the punishment. All you learn to do is learn to associate punishment with your father or whatever. I hear my printer going off. Yeah, so yeah, that's always a good one. Always like a pick a switch. It's like, and then you bring in one too small to hurt you, and then they'll go out and grab a whole big branch. I'll show you what you need. The joys of childhood. Okay, so bottom line is if, and also think about this, if you're training dogs, and again, I want to help you apply as much of this to animals as possible. When you're training a dog, punishment's not a good way to train them anyway. I highly recommend against it. Don't ever hit a dog. You can use a noxious stimuli, and I do this myself if you want to stop a behavior. You know, I use like a act sound, and if I do that, sure enough, Seamus turned and looked at me like, what am I doing? And I go, no, you're okay. Because whenever I did that, he learned to stop his behavior, but he learned to come to me because then I would pet him and praise him. And really what I wanted him to do was stop whatever behavior he was doing. If he was chewing something or getting into something he shouldn't be getting into, I could stop him with that noxious behavior. But he learned that pleasure was going to follow that. I was going to pet him. And so that's what I would always do. I didn't ever punish him even using a noxious stimuli with that very unpleasant sound. But I always made sure that I praised him and you know, petted him when he would respond to that sound. I actually had a Dickens, the dog that was Seamus's playmate when he was young. It was a runner. He was a roach too. You've seen how big he was. I could not believe that the amount of space that was all he required to get out of the fence. But I had trained him never to punish him for coming home. It was always, good boy, you came back. I'm so happy, you know. And so he was always happy to come back, and became easy if and my neighbors could do that. If they saw Dickens get out of the fence, they just go, Dickens, he'd turn right back around, come back to him, and he was happy. So don't punish your dog for coming home. I can't emphasize that enough. So many people are, where you been? Why'd you run away for it? No, don't do that. It violates all the principles of learning, and you're not going to teach your dog anything but to avoid you when they run away. They don't want to come home to somebody that's mean to them. They want to come home to somebody that's, hey, they're going to be nice to them. They're going to pet them, praise them, maybe give them a treat. Yeah. So keep that in mind in your pet training that goes on, but especially with dogs, because I don't think you can train cats quite as well as dogs. But they still respond to these principles too. It's just not as obvious or as fast, I don't think. They have more instinct, I guess. Okay, but the bottom line here is make sure that the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus happen as close together as you can get them. Okay, that's going to be important for the acquisition of the learning. You know, and I guess the one last thing to mention here, what you want is for the conditioned stimulus, which is, say, the footsteps that are coming to the room, to predict what's coming next, so that you know that, okay, if you hear my footsteps, I'm bringing Whataburgers, your mouth is going to water. You can predict that that's what's going to be following that conditioned stimulus. Okay. Now we're going to talk about generalization and discrimination. I'm happy to say discrimination in this case really doesn't have anything to do with racism or anything like that, although it could apply to that too. But that's not what we're going to be talking about in this particular case. Generalization basically means that a conditioned stimulus can be similar to other things, that you could hear footsteps of other people. And what you do is that if you hear somebody else's footsteps and maybe sounded like a little bit like mine, then you might salivate anyway. You kind of generalize the conditioned stimulus, or it could be several different things. It might be that a certain bell sounds and you know the class is over. But if you hear a similar bell, you might have to look at the clock. Oh, really? No, it's not over. But you still thought, because the bell sounded kind of similar. You had that generalization, if you will, that they might be getting the same desirable response. Yay, class is over. I can move on with my life. Okay. So also, then we got discrimination. And this is where you learn to respond to certain conditioned stimuluses and not others. You learn to tell the difference. You would learn to tell the difference between my footsteps and somebody who, say, weighs 50 pounds less and wears a different kind of shoe. You know, I don't wear high heels. So if you heard the footsteps that were obviously high heels coming down the hall, that's not going to elicit, generally, hopefully not, I really hope not, the conditioned response. You know it's somebody else. You know that you're not getting food. You have to wait to hear my footsteps. So discrimination merely means, in this case, that you learn to tell the difference between the stimulus headed your way. Any questions on this stuff? You know, another way to look at discrimination is when you take a multiple choice test, you've got to somehow discriminate the correct answer from the incorrect answers, do you not? And then if you've got an all of the above, you really have to do a little bit finer discrimination. So there's that's going on there at that point in time. Is anybody in here colorblind? It's more likely to be a male, because that's one of those X chromosome or Y chromosome deficiencies that males tend to have. Somehow, though, you've got to learn to discriminate the stoplights. When red is not a color that you see, you've got to learn to discriminate where the lights are when they come on, so that you can tell what you're seeing and what you need to do at the stoplight. So there's all sorts of little possibilities with this. And I could go on and on about the examples, but hey, we've only got so much time. All right. You about to ask a question?
My friends came to visit me from Oregon a month ago, and they were
Uh-oh, you cut off at Oregon. You lost Oregon.
Okay, can you hear me?
Now, I can't,
My friends from Oregon came to visit, and they were very surprised to find that our street lights are sideways instead of up and down. So that might throw somebody off.
you know, ours were up and down when I was young. We would have, yeah, there would be like three, just the red, yellow, green. They were all over the place, but I don't know why they changed, but sure enough. That is, yeah, I guess that would throw you off though if you had to make that change. At least I got to make it gradually. What every other street corner. Now, if I see one straight up and down, it's like nostalgia. I feel young again. I'm gonna have to go to Oregon and feel young. I don't know what that would feel like, but okay. So next thing here we're going to talk about is how do you get rid of these habits? About extinction and spontaneous recovery. Recovery. There is a Y at the end of that. My little finger got got jumpy. So let's say we need to get rid of a bad habit, you know. Maybe you, what's a good example of this? What if your dog jumps on you every time that you walk in the door and you don't want, they're kind of big, and you don't want them doing that. How do you extinguish that behavior?
You can walk into them.
Walk into them, yeah. But what if they're playful and they think you're playing? So normally what happens when something like that happens is they'll get reinforced for it somehow. I need to back up. This is not a good example. Let me think of a better one. I'll just go back to the original example I'm using. Is that every time I bring a plate of Whataburgers into class, you're going to salivate. What if I stop bringing them to class? Are you going to keep salivating forever? Or will you kind of learn eventually that, nah, he stopped doing it. I guess he went broke and, you know, or he doesn't like us anymore, whatever the reason. You'll think things, but the thoughts in this case don't matter. It's all about the behavior. But in a case where you quit coming around with the food, the original unconditioned stimulus, then you no longer will be the conditioned stimulus. If my footsteps will eventually quit bringing about salivation. The dogs would quit salivating when they hear footsteps, but no meat ever arrived. And that's called extinction. You know, this is something that if you present, maybe if you're working with phobias, let's say you've got a fear of snakes, and every time you walk into the classroom, I hand you a snake or show you a snake. Eventually, according to this principle, you'll stop feeling scared of them because the snake never does anything to you. It's just a little garter snake. Okay, here you go. There's a snake. And you go, okay. And at first you go, but after a while you go, yeah, so what? You've extinguished that fear response simply because nothing really happened when you saw the snake. Okay. Now, if I brought in a water moccasin, we might have a different problem.
Garter snakes are actually more jumpy than the bigger snake.
Well, I mean, yeah, I actually had one crawl out of my it crawled out of my engine compartment of the car and became a really wiggly windshield wiper. That got my attention. I don't have a fear of snakes, but now I had to laugh. I thought it was hilarious, and we had to herd it away. We got a picture of me herding this garter snake about this long off of a road, which I'm not going to show in class. Okay, and how many of y'all have ever read Peanuts? I know the strip still runs, I think. And there's the classic thing of Charlie Brown wants to kick the football and Lucy always pulls it away, right? Life doesn't work like that. There would come a time, no matter how dumb Charlie or trusting Charlie Brown is, eventually he would learn not to go kick that football, okay? That he would actually, that behavior would be extinguished, at least as far as Lucy holding it. Okay, so that would be, you would learn to predict that the original thing wasn't going to happen. You learn to predict, I'm not going to be bringing hamburgers anymore. So your conditioned response would stop. Now you'd still have the unconditioned response to hamburgers. That would still be there, but you don't get it anymore with my footsteps. We call that extinguished. Okay, but what if, let's say we We go through another half term, and then you have to take me for another class again 2 months down the line. What's an interesting thing is the first time you'd hear my footsteps and you recognize it coming down the hall, you would probably salivate again, because that old learning would kick back in that you had, that, oh, here comes food. And we call that spontaneous recovery. So and again, time is a factor here. That I stop the extinguish behavior sequence where I quit bringing the Whataburgers, and then I go 2 months without seeing you, and then you come back and you have to take another class from me. I know you'd like to take history. I'd love to teach history someday, but I don't have the credentials. But let's just say, for instance, I'm teaching history, and VTI all of a sudden requires you to take that as part of your general ed program. And you hear my footsteps, and you know I'm coming because you've seen my name as the teacher of this class. Bingo, you will probably start salivating again, because that is spontaneous recovery. Now, from that point, if I don't bring hamburgers in ever again, you will extinguish much faster than you did the first time. Okay, that will occur naturally, but you will, after a period of time, have that spontaneous recovery. I'll tell you a good real life example of this. How many of you have seen a person you had a relationship with some time ago, and you haven't seen him for maybe a couple of years, and you see him again, and no matter, even if the breakup wasn't good, there's a good chance you might have a bit of that, spark of that old feeling you used to have. And that's a good example of spontaneous recovery. Now, it can go away pretty quick. Sometimes it can go away as quick as they open their mouth and you go, oh yeah. But the first sight of them is probably going to give you a little charge. Okay, that is a spontaneous recovery. Maybe not one you want to have, but yeah, it's there. It's sometimes, yeah, I'm not recommending it, but I'm just saying that's a natural thing that happens to us, because we had a lot of learning with these people at one time. There was a time when it was pleasant, it was fun, that it was love maybe. And while you have gotten over them, you're fine now, you might see them and go, oh, wow, that was really cool. So one time that actually happened to me, and I saw, and it'd been 15 years since we last seen each other, and I didn't ever expect to see her again. And I ran into her in a social situation where we were going to be together for like a whole day on a sailboat. And it turned out to be really pleasant. It actually kind of got rid of the toxic ending of our relationship. We didn't pick it back up again, but it was a nice closure day, if nothing else. So it's not always a bad thing. So, okay. So that's spontaneous recovery. And again, you can extinguish that faster. So, all right. Oh, so we're about at the end of class. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to start off with a couple of films for you. So that'll be not tomorrow. If you come tomorrow, you're going to be alone in class. Monday, and that'll be a pleasant way to start Monday. I'll have a couple of films for you to show before we move into the ways we can use classical conditioning, practical effects. And I've already touched on a few of those, some ways to train dogs and stuff. And I'll give you more of that too on Monday. Something to look forward to. So anyway, y'all have a good weekend. Be safe out there. Make sure everybody comes back on Monday. That's the way I like it. I'm getting closer to the end of March now. So any questions on this? I'll stick around a little bit. If not, y'all have a good one.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye,
That's the
Mr.
plan.
Fahey.
Bye, y'all.
Don't party too hard with your dog.
At my age, that's only one beer anyway. So
Bye, Mr. Fahey. Have a nice weekend.
thanks, you too. Hear that, Seamus? They want us to have a good weekend.